This year, Tamils around the world mark the 40th anniversary of what's called Black July. It recognizes the deadly events that transpired in 1983. Widely referred to as a pogrom against Tamils in Sri Lanka by the Sinhalese majority, it left thousands dead and set in motion a civil war that lasted more than a quarter century. The reverberations of those events continue to this day. For more, we're joined by Roy Ratnaval, author of Prisoner 1056, How I Survived War and Found Peace, and Kududia Kulendran, a Tamil Canadian who survived Black July, and Samantha Krishnapillai, founder, managing director, and editor-in-chief of the On Canada Project, and a first-generation Tamil Canadian. Welcome to all of you in studio. I should say vanakkam.
Great to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you all here. I should mention off the top to our viewers and our listeners on podcast, you will hear us say Tamil, you will hear us say Tamil. They both mean the same thing. It's just an anglicized version of the word. All right, so let's start our conversation with some background on Sri Lanka and the events of Black July. First, the island nation is located in the Indian Ocean off the east coast of India with a population of 22 million. Tamils and Sinhalese account for the two largest ethnic groups. Colombo, as you can see on the map there with the star, is Sri Lanka's largest city. In regards to Black July refers to the violent riots against Tamils that began on July 24th, 1983. Over 7 days, mobs of mainly Sinhalese attacked Tamil targets, burning, looting, and killing. According to the National Council of Canadian Tamils, the death toll is estimated to be around 3,000. More than 8,000 homes and 5,000 shops were destroyed. More than 150,000 Tamils were made homeless. These events were largely seen as the catalyst for a civil war that lasted 26 years and sent hundreds of thousands of Tamils into exile. All right, with that context, Kududia, I'm going to come to you first. For those who are unfamiliar with the history and the tensions between Tamils and Sinhalese, what would you say are some of the key points of disagreement between those two groups? Because there is a lot.
There's a lot, and it's going to take days to fully explain the whole nuances of it, because it's important to remember that the island was colonized in 3 waves, from the Dutch in the Netherlands to starting off with the Portuguese, then the Dutch, and then the British. And what they left was not an island how they found it. So the inheritance of colonization is two communities torn apart, a fabric completely ripped asunder. And the discord that is to date is around identity and rights of existence on the same one island, the way it was before. So on the surface, it is about I exist and you exist. We are on the same island, finite land, but it's also down to appropriation of resources, colonization of dry land, recognizing that generations that were born were spread out like dandelions across the globe, and they still have identity back to the island. So to put it down into one simple sentence is impossible, but it is about existence and the right to live.
Roy, I'm going to come to you. You know, a lot of people, as I mentioned, look at the riots as this catalyst, but you can go back into history. If we start at 1948, when the country was independent, and there are a number of sort of acts. And one act I want to hone in on is the Sinhala Only Act. What does that mean, and what did that represent at that time?
Yeah, it was, so 1948 was the independence given by Great Britain to Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. In 1956, the first prime minister enacted discriminatory laws, one of them being Sinhala Only Act, which means that every Tamil has to learn Sinhala, or Sinhalese language, in order to qualify for a job in the government or any public service arena. So Tamil felt that was a forceful attack on the ability to make economic gains in the country, and that led to many other things. Standardization was the other one, which was basically saying Tamil students got to score more points to get into medical faculty, engineering faculty, and physical science, so on and so forth. Combination of many things, as was mentioned earlier. It's not a simple one event that took place, but it was just a festering of slowly taking away rights of Tamils systematically that created this war, which became it was simmering all the time up until 83, and then 83 riots happens, and then everything all hell broke loose, and here we are 30-some years later, or 40 years later, not a single perpetrator of the act is ever brought to justice.
And if I may add very briefly, is that one can't look at the Sinhala-only Act in a silo, because around that same time, there was a very important pact that was being tabled called the Bandaranaike Chelvanayakam Pact, which would have created a federal state very similar to what we have here in Canada with Quebec and the rest of Canada, that would have enshrined language rights and protect dry land, and also given citizenship to all the Tamils who are of Indian origin, who were brought in by the British to as indentured labor to populate and provide labor for the tea plantations. All of that was thrown out.
All right, Samantha, I do want to bring you into this conversation. When we talk about colonization, the role, I think there's a lot, we can look at Sri Lanka as a silo, but we can take a look at sort of colonization, the role of colonization between Tamils and Sinhalese. Talk to us a little bit about that in terms of the role of that.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'd also like to say that I really struggle with the language of civil war. I think a civil war, I look at, like in America, there was a civil war, there was the North and the South, and there was organization, there was, people, like it was not, I don't think a government versus like systemically discriminating against a community and then whatever emerged from that community to defend their rights. I'm not saying everything was good or bad or any of those pieces, I don't think you can call that a civil war. And I think it makes it sound like there were good people on both sides when the responsibility of a government and what that government did in the same way Canada's government with Indigenous people, like America and Canada's with Black people, like it's a failure on the state. And I really had to heal that thought in my head over the last few years. Because when you tell people yeah, we had a civil war, they're like, yeah, that sucks. But that's not really what it was. At least not to me, and I say this as someone who was born here. So maybe people who experienced it, that's what it felt like, and I'm sorry to have an opinion based on that, yeah.
In terms of the role of colonization, when we talk about that.
I think I've been writing a lot about colonialism and how the stories of our experiences in Sri Lanka and what our people went through is not different from what colonization has done everywhere else. There's a playbook that colonizers use, and one of the things they do is divide and conquer. So within that space, they create divisions between the ethnicities that are there. Because if you have to fight each other, you're not going to fight your oppressor. I haven't been able to read about it as it relates specifically to Sri Lanka, but there's enough literature out there about what happened in India and documentation of the British speaking to we cannot allow them to come together again to rise up. Right. We've got to pit them against each other, and the intentional effort to create division and hate to an island that prior to colonialism coexisted. I'm sure imperfectly, but they coexisted. And I think that's where it really becomes difficult for me to just view from 1948 to now and be man, those Sinhalese people, when it feels like everyone should be held responsible, and also so should the British, the Dutch, and the Portuguese.
Roy, I want to come to you. We know that Sinhalese are primarily Buddhist, and Sri Lankan Tamils are primarily Hindu. Curious, was religion ever a factor in this conflict?
Well, this is not a war about just culture, it's about religious identity as well. So if you look at Sri Lankan history since the independence, the Sri Lanka's ingrained anti-Tamil sentiment and the whipped up British nationalist hysteria were a perfect cement for an odious system where politicians were able to capitalize on that fear because the enraged, scared people are easily manipulated. And this is always one of the bone of contentions I have with Sinhalese friends, is that they say, the politicians. Well, you elect them. You repeatedly keep electing the same people over and over and expecting a different result. So current president of the country was elected the 7th time. Now, how do you expect that man to have a different policy that's going to have a different outcome? And to the colonization point, I would say that, again, the Sinhalese friends I have would say, oh, it's because of the colonization. That's an easy crutch. Look at Singapore. They had 3 distinct groups, Indians, Malays, and Chinese. They built a country that is now the richest country per income capita in the world. In 1960, they were the poorest country in the world. So I think, while I understand colonization has its impact, but at the end of the day, it's been hundreds of years now since Sri Lanka got independence. And this whole notion about we're just going to keep blaming Great Britain for all our ills, it is hard to fathom, at least for me, because I see other countries that actually progress so well with the same divisions and distinct cultures within it.
All right, we're going to pick up on those points. I do want to get into our personal stories because I know that's where a lot of us, we have shared some thoughts. So we will come back to a couple of those thoughts.
Okay, I'm glad.
Thank you so much.
Kirudia, you were only 12 years old, and you were in Colombo the nights the riots broke out. What were your memories of that evening?
It was going from celebration of a local temple festival with my family, because that's my birthday month. Evenings spent with neighbors in the front yard with music and chatter. Overnight, having my grandfather is an inspector of police, and at that time he was with he had retired, but he was still very much respected in Vellavatha. He was a past inspector of police of Vellavatha. And he was working for a security company, and him coming back and alerting, and we lived in Vellavatha, which is, I would say, primarily Tamil. Coming back and literally knocking on every door of our street and telling them, pack up, trouble's coming. We went from celebration to people screaming, women screaming as they were being raped, houses being burnt, my mother, I, and my grandmother running and being transported in trucks to refugee camps. We were hiding in a neighbor's house. I witnessing Buddhist monks and thugs coming down my street with machetes and pointing to houses very clearly, knowing which houses had Tamils.
Because they were using voter records.
They knew. They were given information. So our house was very close to a railway line that ran on the coast, the western coast. And we had neighbors who said the train was stopped. So the train came with thugs, fully loaded, and it would stop at each junction where there was an offshoot of a street. And then the thugs would get off the train, and the train would continue. So whomever was driving the train and controlling the train knew what they were doing as well. Food that was delivered to the refugee camps were rotten, spoiled, and caused great illness and dysentery for the people at the refugee camp. Arbitrarily, those who were supposed to watch over and protect us at the refugee camp would set off guns and shoot into the air in the middle of the night so that we couldn't sleep. Watching my grandmother and my mother be terrified that I was going to be raped and trying to hide me. Babies turning up dead in the washrooms in the refugee camp. Incredible lineups for the one tap that had water. People turning up with blood all over them through the night. And I'm one of the lucky ones to survive.
Right. Roy, that's similar language. I've heard you say lucky a few times. In your book, you detail the horrors. You weren't in Colombo. You were in the north at the time. But you detail the horrors of being a prisoner of war at the age of 17. You were taken from your home in front of your parents by Sri Lankan army. Why were you targeted by the Sri Lankan army?
It wasn't just me. It was so 1987, there was an operation called Operation Liberation. Basically, the Tamil Tigers controlled a swath of land, a northern part, but it's a region called Bandaranaike, which is where Point Pedro, my ancestral hometown, is. So they were closing in to recapture the land. So the order was by the army to arrest any Tamil man between the age of 14 and 40, and I was 17, so I was right in that age gap. So they arrested myself and 2,700 other people, shackled us and put it on a cargo ship and took us on a 6-day or 5-day voyage to the south called Gaul. It's with a camp called Busa. And I was kept there for 2.5 months and routinely tortured along with everybody else. And some of my friends never made it. And as was mentioned by Kritika, is that I'm one of the lucky ones to be able to get out of there and sit here in a civilized country and have a civil discourse, and which is still lacks in Sri Lanka, sadly.
Samantha, you are a first-generation Tamil Canadian, just like me. These are conversations and stories that may have been shared, may have not. What was it like in your household? Was the events of Black July talked about? Was conflict and war talked about?
Yeah, I'd like to, at some point, come back to the comment about a civilized country being in Canada. I have thoughts around that, but yeah, I'll be honest. It wasn't really talked about. I really struggled to understand what my spot was in the world. I felt like it was so easy to find out, what king was, how many wives Henry VIII had, or whatever number he was. But it was so much harder to learn my history, and then that made me feel like our history wasn't good. We were not worth the same. Of course, racism exists when we couldn't even keep our records, That, feeling of internalized racism stayed with me for a very, very long time. And I would say that I think the vast majority of us who live within Canada carry a piece of that internalized racism because we're trying to find success in a space that's designed around whiteness and white supremacy culture. But yeah, Black July was not really spoken about at home. And if it was called the riots, not really Black July. And it wasn't really until until 2009, really, where it kind of started to come up.
Right, there were protests. You went to one. You didn't even know.
At that point, it was I had gathered it, but not because we had sat down and talked about it. It was more like the pieces of it was being shared with me. Or someone at school that was Tamil had mentioned, it's not the way you could sit down and read a book about it. It was kind of offered in weird ways to me over time. But then we had the protests, and then it wasn't really until my own deep research and then pushing my parents to share it, because I also didn't want to be here, please give me all your trauma that they've in order to find success and give me the life I have here today. Maybe part of that survival involved pushing it down, and I can't fault them for that when mental health conversations still aren't where they need to be in our community. So yeah, it wasn't really discussed.
Kritika, you are a parent. You have 2 kids. I'm curious, how did you navigate that conversation? Because you had made an effort to let them sort of figure out their journey and stuff, and if they had come to you with questions, that was sort of the idea.
So my husband and I, he's also Tamil, when we became parents, we made a conscious decision that we didn't want to raise our children mired and in the sense of locked into the identity of what he and I have journeyed through. Though he was not on the island for 83, he himself has lost very close family at point blank range to bullets from Sri Lankan army guns. His grandfather, his uncles, multiple deaths in his family, and immense loss to his family. So the first time I went public with my story was for the 25th anniversary of the July pogrom. And I struggled with even the title of Black July because that is, it connotates something very negative and should not be minimizing any community as such. I would much prefer a July pogrom. And that decision was not an easy one. Now, having said that, within my own generation, within the communities of my mother and my grandmother and our cousins, with my husband and my cousins and the extended family of our generation, we would talk about it. But as Samantha said, it was the riots, or there would be narratives. Now, something that we rarely get to speak about is something horrific that happened in 1981 as a precursor to the riots. And that was the burning of the Jaffna Library. Jaffna being the northernmost prolific city for where the Tamil population was. The loss of this library, and to put it into a North American context, is if the Yale Library burnt by intent, arson, malicious intent, if somebody went out there and set the Yale Library aflame, and the outrage that would come would permeate across from coast to coast to coast, and not be limited to just USA, it would come to Canada and across the world. That is the loss of intellectual knowledge and historical heritage. There were palm leaves that were thousands of years old that had a continuity of the story of the Tamil people on this planet, Tamil being one of the most ancient languages and recognized globally. I have a cousin in our family, who witnessed that burning. And it traumatized him so deeply that he never quite recovered. And as much as he did come to Canada and be accepted as a refugee, and may have had the semblance of whatever structural safety that Canada gave, he never recovered. And it was a key impact in his life till he took it himself. That is the outpouring. So when we raised our children, at the 25th anniversary, my children, my son at 9 and my daughter at 7, got to hear my story because I was one of the living exhibits. My son's reaction was, "Why didn't you tell me?" My daughter, being much younger, was more of, "What is a refugee camp? What does that mean? Where did you sleep? Did you get food?" Subsequently, they were at an age where their inquiry was driven by themselves. So now they call themselves Tamil Canadian, fully informed by themselves, and are completely anchored in an identity that they have formulated and own.
All right, we are going to get to conversations about identity. Roy, I do want to come to you. Your start in Canada is a story I think is very relatable to many. You had $100 in your pocket. You were eager to make something to make your family proud, but you had war in the background. Your parents were both back home. What would you say was the toughest part about coming here?
Well, just not knowing anyone. I was young, 18 years old, never left the country. You lose your friends, your family, your social fabric, your safety net. You had to come here, learn a new language, new cultures, figure out a way to make a living. So that was the hardest part. And but I sort of give my rise in this country, just like many of us, Tamil community, who have done really well in this country, in one decade, one generation, that's 30 years, we have lifted ourselves from misery to prosperity and victims to victors. And to me, it's a remarkable journey collectively, not just me. I mean, every single person that I know who came here from Sri Lanka had achieved success in their own right. And so for me, I was lucky enough to have had many great mentors when I came here, very young. And that really helped me to adapt to this country in the absence of advice of my parents. And so that was what happened.
How, in your book is titled, You Found Peace. And one who's read your book would have to ask, how do you not become bitter? You're someone who, at 18, at a very young age, comes to this country, don't know many people. You lose your father shortly after, within days, and sort of have to figure out how to balance all of that. You do visit back home at some point.
One time, yeah.
One time to go visit Point Pedro. But how do you not become bitter?
So, listen, 2 days after I landed, my father was shot and killed. So, given his untimely, unjust death, it left me with the feeling, if I did well enough in life, somehow I could give the life that he always wanted to have. So I had to live for two people. Emotional wounds never heal, they fester. So earlier on, I was very bitter, angry at the world, up until maybe my late 20s. Nothing good ever came from that. So I had this belief that even though past events can be changed, they can serve as a lesson in dealing with challenges of life to pursue a life of happiness. And when you can't change the situation, you're forced to change yourself. So what I decided to do is to not to let my past trip me every single time, to focus on the future. Future is that if I built a life for myself that is happy, well-adjusted, and I could somehow justify my father's, him sending me here to make him proud, make my parents proud. So that became my coal for the furnace of ambition, per se, just drove me, became sort of my single goal. But it came at an expense. I mean, I reflect on that in the book about how much it left the emotional deficit in the house, with my relationship with my wife. But now I'm looking at it in my early 50s, I can sort of reconcile all that. I would have done things differently. But nonetheless, I would give myself a 5 out of 10 still. And so it's really, one of the reasons I wrote the book is to give a voice to the upcoming generation, and also to tell our story, our collective story, our trauma to the world. And then to really give, in my opinion, homage to a country that gave us a second lease in life. By no means is a perfect nation. It has its flaws, but it's a million times better than what I left behind, I can tell you that. And so that's why I wanted to write this book, and to give some color to that.
All right, we only have a few minutes, but I have lots more questions to ask. Samantha, in Ontario, we have Tamil Genocide Education Week. Federally, there is Tamil Genocide Remembrance Day. Is there a reluctance to call it a genocide worldwide? There is this, in terms of when we talk about sort of the language around it, you talked about it a little bit when we talked about civil war. Is there any reluctance at all in terms of understanding that this wasn't as fair?
If it was a genocide or not?
Correct.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't called it anything else other than that. So it's hard to think of it not being called that, because that's what it was. And I don't think I need some Harvard professor to say it. I've heard the stories, I've heard what happened, I've looked into it myself. It was a genocide. And I think it's important to call things what they are as accurately as possible, so that we're able to identify it, name it, heal from it. So I hope, is that what that week is called? That's great, that's awesome. They should call it that, and they should keep calling it that until there aren't genocides in the world.
Kira, I'll get your take on that as well.
It is a genocide. I wish it was, but it is. It is still ongoing.
You're right. Sorry.
The colonization is still ongoing. The rapes are still ongoing. The forced sterilizations are still ongoing. People aren't talking about it. Unfortunately, the structure of the world is such that unless an old white man in a seat of power says it is a genocide, it doesn't matter. George W. Bush said Darfur was a genocide. Automatically, right away, funding happened, recognition happened, documentaries happened. But we had eminent, highly respected humanitarian lawyers that were recognized by Amnesty write books calling what is happening to the Tamil people genocide. How much more argument do we need? The people themselves say it. It is not a matter of how many people have died. It is not a matter of whether how many whales are dying or how many ants are being stomped on. They all matter. If the people say it's a genocide because the evidence before you is systematic eradication of knowledge, like the burning of the Jaffna Library, the forced sterilization, the forced colonization of dry lands, the removal of language rights, and the erasure of places of faith and temples and houses and renaming of streets, all the hallmarks as defined by United Nations for genocide, it is a genocide. It walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it's a duck.
All right. Outside looking in, so much of the Tamil experience here in Canada is linked to war, is linked to trauma, is linked to genocide. What do you want people to know about Tamils beyond that? I'll start with Roy.
I think we're one of the most resilient group of people. I say that with 100% certainty of what we have achieved in this country. It come at a cost. I mean, a lot of people have not spoken about the war, a lot of mental issues in the community, as Samantha mentioned, including my mother, who suffered severely under mental illness, which one of the reasons I support the topic talking about that, because mental illness is a taboo in any community, especially in our community. I would say, you know, if you were to sum up Tamils in one word, resilient. And I think what we have achieved in 30 years is remarkable. I think probably one of the most successful immigrant groups in the recent times. All
right, Samantha.
Yeah, I think that resilience is an interesting word. This is hard because, like, culturally, I don't want to contradict with you because you're my elder and I want to, like, be respectful of it. But at the same time, I'm feeling a visceral reaction to some of the stuff you're saying, particularly around naming it as, like, you know, we've come so far. We have, but like, in a country that is committing a genocide against Indigenous peoples, not unlike what we experienced or you experienced back there. And so I think it's hard because you both and ancestrally have experienced colonization and has experienced by the British, but also, like, currently, presently, what's going on there, that oppression. And then you're coming here, and I'm, like, so grateful you all came here. I have a life here because you came here. And we are complicit in the genocide of Indigenous people here. And I respect and I understand why that is hard for the older generations, but for people born here, we cannot look at that issue as separate. Doing so is failing the people who were killed in Sri Lanka. Doing so is failing what happened to all of us and, like, ancestrally happened to us. And that's really hard for me to hear us talk about how successful we are when I think about the lack of clean water for Indigenous people, the erasure of their history, the sexual assault, the fact that there's an ongoing genocide against missing and murdered Indigenous women in this country that nobody talks about, but it's happening every single day. Like, this is the actual issues that we need to be talking about as Tamils because, and I say this all the time when I write, Canada will never, ever care about Tamils in Sri Lanka. It doesn't care. It's not going to care. It might, if that Canada cared about the human rights of every single person within its borders. If Canada can care about Indigenous peoples, Black peoples, trans people, migrants, low-income people, disabled people, people of color, if it cares about those people because of their human rights and they should be valued, then that Canada will show up for justice in Sri Lanka and India and every other country that's being impacted. So it's really hard for me to separate that because my identity is both. I have a birthright to my Tamil identity, and by virtue of the dumb luck of being born, right? No control over it, but being born here, I have to hold both of those. So yeah, I just wanted to say that.
Thank you for that. Kiru, we only have about 30 seconds left. That was a very that was a very important but very powerful point. As a takeaway, what do you want people to know about Tamils beyond that, if you want to pick up on what Samantha had to say as well?
So something that I resonate deeply with is to say, je suis Canadian Tamil. Je me souviens. And that means deeply to me. Because the Quebec in their message of Je me souviens is the story of the Tamils. And as a settler to this country, to have the privilege to be able to turn a tap and have fresh water, to know that my children get to walk relatively safe, given that they are still of color, and to have access to economy, education, and growth comes at a price of knowing that the Indigenous of this land and I share the same colonizer. And with that comes responsibility that I, as a parent, as a mother, must educate my children what that responsibility means and to unpack it in a way that every September 30th, it is not enough to wear an orange shirt and wave the flag of Every Child Matters, because if Every Child Matters in the island of Sri Lanka and the Tamil child matters, the Indigenous child matters. Every residential school grave that has a child buried, Indigenous child buried, there's an Indigenous child buried in Jaffna and the East in Batticaloa and wherever in Bani. If every child matters for me as a Tamil, every child matters for the country. That is my heartland. I am very proud to be Canadian. I will give my last breath to this country. This is my home. I am not leaving. I am Canada. But with that comes responsibility to own every aspect of being Canadian. And I owe it to this land that is my home. And every tree that gives me oxygen to breathe, I need to fight to protect. And the rivers, I need to fight to protect. And my message is to be proud to be Tamil. And to be Tamil is not from a particular demographic or geography. Tamils are across this globe. It doesn't matter if you're from South Africa, Mauritius, Japan, Singapore, Malaysia, Switzerland, France. We are all Tamil, and stop the division.
Kiridia, Samantha, Roy, thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much for sharing your stories. Very powerful stuff. Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.